Thank you. It's good to see that some people are still here and awake. Maybe just general, my presentation will be more on working with modern websites in Google search, so not websites in general in search. Who here has a website or works on a website? Okay, a bunch of you. All right, who doesn't have a website? Very few. Okay. It's good to see like how many people are actually awake if you like combine the two. So some people are awake. That's good. We can start with that. All right. So there are lots of misconceptions, I think, around modern websites and JavaScript and search. And we often see things like this. JavaScript hurts your SEO, your website will disappear. If you talk to people who make websites online and work with search, they often say, oh, it's a JavaScript framework. Oh, that doesn't work. So when you look at Angular, we see that a lot. So it's killing your SEO. Or even worse, this hurts most because I work at Google. It's like even Google doesn't support Angular in search. It's embarrassing. But some people have figured it out, and this is apparently the answer. It's because of all of those curly braces in Angular. So who here has used Angular? All right, some of you. Have you seen curly braces in your code? Yeah, okay. So apparently this is because of the curly braces, but not really. So hopefully we can find out some details. All right, so I looked at some of the websites that you've probably also used, and I wanted to see how they actually work with search, because from my point of view, a lot of this is misconceptions, but it also depends a bit on how you make your website. So I checked one website that you might have tried out, devsite.ch. Who has looked at this website before? Done something there. All right, a few of you. So the good news is you put it in this mobile-friendly testing tool, and it says, this page is mobile-friendly. So that's a good start, I guess. The bad news is this white box here on the side. That's actually how Google sees the page. So it's mobile-friendly because everybody sees nothing, which probably isn't what the goal is here. So I will have some information on what kind of problems to look into with a website like this. As an exercise, all of you can maybe go home and look at this website and think about what is actually the problem here. Why does Google not see this? Why is like this website dying in search? So when you look for this website in search, it looks like this. We know that this website exists. We know that there's a homepage. There's some description on the homepage, but we don't know anything else about this website. So this, on the one hand, it's a good start, but it's not really what you want. So if you look for the schedule, you say devsite ch schedule, like, well, I don't know. There's not much of the Swiss schedule here actually findable in search. And you all probably know where to go, but imagine if you had something like a Google Home at home or some other device where you wanted to see when is this session or when is another session at DevFest. You can't find that information because Google doesn't know about it. So there's some things to improve here. On the other hand, if you look at some of the other DevFests, they do have a schedule online. You can find it. So it's not that Google hates DevFest in general. It's more that something is broken on this website in the way that it works on a phone or it works on a laptop, but not for search. All right. So taking a quick step back, briefly about me. I work as a webmaster trends analyst at Google here in Switzerland. Which means I work directly with the web search team. I work with the engineers who are creating web search, the crawling, the indexing, ranking part. I've been doing that for over 9 years now. I'm not a JavaScript developer, so some of the things you might hear me say might not be perfect from a JavaScript point of view, but I look at things more from the search side. And this is Googlebot on the side. You'll see some more of Googlebot during the presentation. So, My session has mostly two parts, like what search needs, how web search works, focusing mostly on Google, but a lot of this works for other search engines as well, and how rendering works, which is how Google looks at, for example, JavaScript-heavy pages, how it can figure out what the content is there. And then some on fixing these issues and some useful tools. All right, so this is essentially the start of a search engine. This is something that a lot of search engines do, but I think it's important to understand when you look at a website and how it's shown in search, like what is actually happening here. We start off with a collection of known URLs. So these are URLs that we've seen before, that people have linked to, that we found online. We can't crawl them all at once, because I think the internet would melt if we tried to do that. I think last year we looked at how many URLs we know about, and it's over 130 trillion URLs. So that's a lot of pages on the internet, and we'd like to crawl them all as quickly as possible, but we have to prioritize. And that's done by the scheduler. The scheduler takes the known URLs, and then it goes off and crawls them from the internet. When we've crawled them, we take the content that we've received, we bring that content into our index, and we try to render the pages, like a browser would try to do. And then when we have everything in our index, we take all the links to the new pages and try to follow those as well. And this is a cycle that continues on and on and on. So what search needs to actually function is this list of URLs. We have to know which URLs to actually look at. So for us, it's really important, and this is one of the things that a lot of modern frameworks have been kind of not doing that well. We need to have unique and indexable URLs. So we need to have a URL that you can take and you can use wget or curl to actually fetch the content. As a bonus, we'd like to be able to actually look at those URLs. So make sure that they're not blocked, that we get some content back, and that we get some links to other pages within your website. So if we start with the dev site homepage, then we can find the schedule, we can find information about the speakers, about the location, all of that by following the links. So what's important for us in a URL? Essentially, if you've worked with websites, you know what a URL looks like. It's not that complicated for the most part, but it's something that for us in search is really what everything pivots around. So having a good, clean URL is important. We don't care so much if you have a path and a file name or if you have parameters. That's totally up to you. What we do care about is if there's a URL with a hash in it. So if it has a hash and then there's a tag or page name, then that's something that we often drop. Another common problem that we see is the same URL for different states. This is something that normally the modern frameworks don't do so much, but we saw a lot in the past where you would have the home page actually running the JavaScript app, and you can do everything on the home page, and it doesn't change the URL. So in a case like that, we don't have any way of addressing specific content on the website. Another thing to watch out for, usually less of a problem with modern frameworks, is irrelevant URL elements like session IDs or usernames and passwords. We can index a lot of this if we find it, and getting it out of the index afterwards is sometimes a bit of a pain. So for Google, since we've seen so many URLs, we've also seen that a lot of them are actually duplicates. So we fetch one URL and it's the same as another one. Sometimes it's like with www in the beginning and without www, and it's the same content. And for us, it's a bit of a pain because then we would have to index everything twice, whereas ideally we would recognize, oh, this is the same, we just fold them together, and we call that a canonical URL. Have any of you heard about canonicalization? Some of you, okay. So This is one way to recognize those who have looked into SEO a little bit already. One of those words that nobody uses otherwise. So we take all of these duplicates, we pick one URL as a representative, and that's the one that we focus on. You can tell us which one you want. You can give us hints about which one is your preferred URL, or we'll just guess and try to take one. But ideally, if you're consistent within your website, within your web app, then we will just use whatever you give us. So that's really useful. Going back to URLs with a hash in them, one of the things that we've done, I don't know, maybe 6, 7 years ago, back when JavaScript was kind of fresher on the web, we worked to create an AJAX crawling scheme where you could have URLs with a hash bang, so the hash and the exclamation mark in them, and we would try to crawl a rewritten version of that URL, and we would expect your website to render the pages for us. So you could use JavaScript to run your site with the hash bang as an identifier, and we will crawl the escaped fragment version, and you need to give us the version that's actually already rendered. So that worked for a while, and I think for a lot of sites it made sense. But in the meantime, things have progressed. You can use things like the history API to provide real normal URLs and still use a JavaScript framework on your site. And we noticed that a lot of sites set this up and they do it wrong or they have problems with it. And it's really hard to diagnose on your side if you don't know where the problem is actually coming from. So we've decided to stop recommending this setup and instead just use normal URLs. All right, AMP and PWA. I assume most of you have heard about AMP and PWA as well, or some of you? Yes. Okay, great, yeah. So these are two technologies that from our point of view, I think are really exciting and kind of future-looking and neat things you can do with them. This presentation doesn't focus on these technologies. We try, from a search point of view, not to give any Google technologies or any Google features any special treatment. So we treat these like any other website that you have out there. So if you use a PWA, you can do that and still have everything indexable. Okay, so how does Googlebot actually render the content? So what we try to do when we recognize that a page uses JavaScript, if it uses a JavaScript framework, we try to render it like we would with a normal modern browser. For the most part, we can do that fairly well. But like you saw with the dev site example, it's something that doesn't always work that well. So there's some things to watch out for, things like promises, service workers, fetch API, local storage. These are not supported by Googlebot. Similarly, ES6 is something that's currently not supported. So if you're trying to use any of the more modern features, it's important that you use polyfills where you can to support older browsers, or to do feature detection to see, does this browser support service workers? And if so, then I'll set up the service worker. If it doesn't support service workers, then have some way to kind of gracefully handle that so that the pages at least still load. Another point, which is kind of more unique to Google as a search engine, is we rely on the robots text file to let us know which parts of your website we can crawl. So it's important for us that we don't cause any issues on your server. And so we go to the robots text file the first time we look at a website and see which parts are we allowed to look at and which parts are we not allowed to look at. And if you use embedded URLs on your page, JavaScript files, CSS, if you use APIs, and they're blocked by robots text, then we can't actually see what's happening there. We can't fetch that JavaScript file. We don't know how to process it. That's a problem for us as a search engine. Another one that comes from being a search engine and not a normal browser is we need to have links that use A elements. So that are normal links, they point to other URLs, rather than just on-click handlers. Because Googlebot is kind of a simple browser. It looks at the page and it tries to find all of these links and crawl through all of those. It doesn't go off and click on everything on a page. So if you have some functionality that gets triggered from an on-hover or from an on-click handler like this, then Googlebot probably won't discover that by itself. It doesn't know where to click or where you add additional functionality. Another thing, so I have a lot of special cases coming up for situations where some of you might be running into these issues, some of you might not. Mobile first indexing is something that we just recently announced. And for us, this is a pretty big shift. For most websites, it shouldn't be that much of a problem. So the difference here is in the past, we've indexed and rendered pages like a desktop browser would. And now that more than half of our users are using smartphones, we think using a desktop browser to index content is a bit obsolete almost. So we're switching to Googlebot using a smartphone as well. And we're indexing the content like you would see it on a smartphone. So this is, from our point of view, a pretty big change. And we need to make sure that all of our other functionalities still continues working. For all of you who are using responsive web design, who are already creating mobile-first websites, this doesn't really change anything. So this is kind of something where the situations where we see most problems are where you have a mobile version of a website that's really bad compared to a desktop version. So if you only have very limited functionality in a mobile website, then that could be a problem. If the content is very limited on a mobile website, then that could be a problem. Whereas if it's already responsive, if it's the same content on both sides, that's perfect. So this is, I think, a good argument to bring if someone comes to you and says, oh, we will just make a very simple mobile version and people can click the view as desktop link if they want to see the full version. That's not going to work in the future. We try to render pretty much all pages that we index, but when we can't render the pages, we tend to fall back to the HTML version of a page. And for all of you who have used a single-page app framework, you will know that the HTML version of this page is very limited. It's essentially just loading the JavaScript content, and then the JavaScript actually pulls in all of the content itself, displays what's needed there. So for single-page apps, that's kind of a problem. And that's something that we saw with the DevFest site as well, where we indexed the raw HTML, but we weren't able to actually see the full content, so we had very limited view of what was actually on this website. One thing that's also kind of unique with search engines is we use some of the metadata that you have on your pages in the head of the page. So there are things that are fairly easy to specify in the head, like a title of the page or the description, which we show in the search results directly. That's kind of the basic part. What's less obvious is things like the robots meta tag, where you can tell us this page should be indexed or it shouldn't be indexed. Or things like you can tell us this is the German version, this is the French version, this is the English version of this page. Google should recognize the connection between these different pages. And these are sometimes hard to test if the page needs to be rendered. So this is one trick that you can do to kind of test this. You can take the page as you would see it in a browser, save it as HTML, and then load that again in a browser to see what the final rendered HTML would look like. And you can test to see if the head includes everything that you expect. One issue that sometimes comes up, especially with websites that use responsive web design, is that you will sometimes take content and you will hide it on a page. You will have something like click to read more, like this, or you'll have a kind of a tab interface where you can click on one tab and the second tab is kind of hidden, and then you click on the tab and it actually displays. This is sometimes a problem for us. So if the content is loaded by default, if it's already in HTML and just hidden by CSS, then we can still take that into account. In search, we tend to devalue that a little bit in the sense that we say, well, a user going to this page will expect this content to be visible. And if it's not visible by default, then maybe it's not the most important content on this page. So that's kind of our thinking there. The more problematic part is when there's an event that actually triggers the loading of this content. So if you click on a tab and then it does an AJAX call and it fetches the content from the server and then displays it, then we don't know that a user could click on this like div or this span or whatever, and that something will happen in the background to actually pull in new content. We don't know about that. So that kind of content, we tend not to index at all. Performance, I guess a lot of you look into performance as well. It's one of the, I think, more important topics on the web, after, of course, making sure that everything works in various browsers. But especially with modern frameworks, we see it all the time that you open one HTML page and it pulls in like hundreds of different resources, and it takes like 10, 20, 30, 40 seconds to actually load the page itself. And for Google, this is a problem as well, because we have all of these billions of pages that we need to crawl and render. And if these pages take a minute or so to actually load all of the content, then we would never get to actually indexing the full web. So I would generally recommend just following the normal performance best practices, reducing the number of requests, bundling your JavaScript, CSS, be careful with third-party dependencies on APIs in particular. So if you have something that relies on some third-party API to get the content, and then you display that content, if that API is slow, then of course your page is going to be slow as well. And finally, of course, use fast servers, content delivery network, so that at least the static content is delivered very quickly. All right, rendering, more rendering. So one way you can also control this on your side is if you do the rendering yourself. So instead of relying on Googlebot, you can render it on your side. There's some frameworks out there that manage to do that for you, or that provide some ways to do that on your side. We recommend making sure that if you do rendering, if you pre-render your content, do it for all users, not just for Googlebot itself. So technically, doing that for Googlebot would be against our webmaster guidelines. It would be showing different content to users and to Googlebot. From a practical point of view, there are some frameworks out there that do that, like pre-render IO, for example. The tricky part here is it's really hard to debug, because you send Google one set of content and you show everyone else a different set of content. And if something breaks in that view that Google sees, then you don't notice that. None of your users notice that. Nobody can tell you, hey, something is broken. So pre-rendering everything for everyone usually makes the pages much faster, and it makes sure that everything is consistent. So this is, the pre-rendering part is often called isomorphic JavaScript. On Angular, it's Angular Universal. There are different ways to set this up. This is, I think, a great way to handle this, but it's sometimes very complicated. So I wouldn't see this as something that you can just switch on and then everything will work. You really have to know what you're doing there, I think. All right, so fixing old issues. So if one of you finds the problems on the DevFest website, like how do you handle that? From Google's point of view, we try to keep it as simple as possible. So you shouldn't need to tell Google that you actually changed something on your website. We should be able to figure that out ourselves. So I put this in 3 steps, which kind of oversimplifies it, because obviously finding the issue first is the hard part. But I would recommend double-checking non-Google dependencies. So even if you're doing this to fix an issue on Google, make sure it still works wherever else you need your website. if you're doing things with Facebook, if you're doing things with social media or other search engines or other platforms, make sure you don't break anything for them. Then, of course, bring up the clean version, the clean URL version. And then if you make URL changes, so particularly from the hash URLs to cleaner URLs, then you need to make sure that you do redirects. So redirects for Google are important because they let us know that we can forward all of the information we know about the old pages to the new pages. Without a redirect, what will happen is we'll see these are new URLs and these URLs disappeared, and we don't know what the connection is. So we essentially start those new pages from zero, and you start at the bottom of the search results again. So with a redirect, that's something that we can try to connect. If you do redirects, make sure you do them direct. If you do JavaScript redirects for hash and hash paying URLs, that's great. Don't show an interstitial, because that's something where Googlebot will get stuck again. And there's some tricks to kind of watch out for here, which we essentially have documented in our Help Center as well with regards to normal site moves. So making sure that you list the old and the new URLs so that we can recrawl them, making sure that you've updated all of the internal references to the old and the new URLs so that we recognize that connection. All right, so let's look at some useful tools. Who has used Search Console before? A handful? Okay, that's good. At least some of you are still awake. That's also good. So Search Console is a tool that we have from Google, which gives you aggregate information on how your website is seen from Google's point of view. So it can tell you which part of your website is kind of broken, gives you information on links to your pages, what we've discovered, when it's shown in the search results, for which queries people are finding your websites. All of this information around search is shown in Search Console. So if you have a website, I'd strongly recommend that you verify your website for Search Console. It's easy to do, not that complicated. And take a look at the settings and the errors that we have there. For modern websites, a lot of these things are less critical, but sometimes things like the crawl rate is important for you to control. If you're seeing that your server is being overloaded with requests from Google, that's something to kind of look into what's actually happening here. If you have a website that is available in multiple countries, then you can tell us this one is for Germany, this one is for Switzerland, this one is for France, and that helps us to say, well, we can show this website more to users in those countries. And finally, I mentioned this last one here, which is kind of the opposite problem of a lot of sites, in the sense that many people want to get into search first, but sometimes you have to take stuff out of search quickly as well. So this happens every now and then, that people index something that shouldn't be indexed. So maybe a bunch of credit card statements, maybe a bunch of address, email lists, or something that you accidentally made available on your website, and Googlebot is being busy and thinks, oh, this is great information to show to everyone in search, which maybe you don't want to have everyone seen. So in Search Console, you can go there and say, this specific URL I want to have removed immediately. And within a day, it'll be removed from search. So that gives you a bit of time to figure out what actually happened here and why was this file on the server in a way that was publicly available, and kind of fix all of that. But by being verified in Search Console, you're prepared for this, and you can handle this very quickly. In Search Console, there's the feature to test how Google renders a page, which we call Fetch as Google and Render. There are two options there. One is to look at the HTML view, which is just the raw HTML. The other is to look at the rendered version of the page, which will be like Googlebot as a desktop browser now, or Googlebot as a smartphone if you want. And it shows you what the page actually would look like to Googlebot. It also lists the blocked embedded URLs, so URLs that are blocked by robots text files, which we can't access. and it gives you a screenshot of what those pages would look like with the block content, if we could crawl the block content and without it. So that's, I think, a really important tool when you're working with modern web frameworks. Sitemap files. So I mentioned sitemap files before. Who here knows what a sitemap file is? All right, a bunch more. That's good. Great. So a sitemap file is basically a list of the URLs on your website. You tell Google that these are the URLs on your website that you know about, which are important for you, and we will take that list and try to make sure that all of these are actually shown in search. So one thing you can do in a sitemap file is specify the change date of the URL. And this is really helpful for us because then we can recognize this page changed. We should go recrawl it now. And these other pages haven't changed in a long time, and we don't have to worry about them as much. So updating the change date is really important for us. One thing that's useful with sitemap files in Search Console is that we show you errors that come from the sitemap file, and you can see the number of indexed URLs from the sitemap file. So if you send us all of your product pages or all of your event pages, then you can look at the sitemap file for the products and see, oh, 90% of these got indexed. That means these are actually doing pretty good. Whereas if you look at the product pages and you see, oh, only like 10 of these pages got indexed and I submitted 100,000 of them, then you can kind of guess that some kind of technical problem is probably still there that you can resolve. All right, so kind of coming to the end. Just as a compressed summary, the most important part, especially for modern frameworks, is to make sure that you have clean URLs. So no hashes in the URLs. I really recommend understanding how Googlebot renders pages, understanding which functionality in modern browsers aren't supported by Googlebot, and then going off and actually testing your pages or testing parts of your pages to make sure that they work. And then hopefully everything will pan out and your pages will be indexed and you'll be happy. So I guess coming back to the DevFest website, I don't know which of you runs a website, but maybe if you leave it the way it is now, that gives others here a chance to kind of look at it and see where could this problem lie. If you can't figure it out at all, then you're of course welcome to contact me as well. We can try to find some answers that help you to figure this out. All right. I don't know how much time we have. All right.
And so for any question or?
Sure. I'm welcome to take questions.